Everyone is watching Europe. Every headline is about NATO. Every discussion is about Ukraine. Every television camera is pointed toward another summit, another speech, another promise. But while the world's attention was fixed on Europe, something else was happening more than 7,000 kilometers away. No emergency press conference, no dramatic breaking news, no global media frenzy. Just a quiet military exercise unfolding off China's eastern coast. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. Another annual naval drill, another week of military cooperation, another official statement about regional stability. Nothing unusual. Or was it? Because history rarely changes in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes history changes quietly. Sometimes it changes because two countries keep working together, year after year, until cooperation becomes routine. And one day, the rest of the world suddenly realizes the balance of power has already shifted. That may be exactly what is happening today. While NATO leaders gathered to discuss Europe's future, Russia and China were quietly expanding something much bigger than another military exercise. The exercise is called Joint Sea 2026. Officially, it is simply another round of annual cooperation between the Russian and Chinese navies. Unofficially, it may represent something far more important. Because military exercises are never only about training. They are about trust, about coordination, about preparation, about learning how two militaries can eventually operate almost as one. And that's why this story matters far more than most people realize. To understand why, we first need to understand what everyone else is watching. While the world watches NATO, this week, the world's political attention returned once again to Europe. NATO leaders gathered to discuss the future of the alliance. The agenda sounded familiar: support for Ukraine, military spending, European security, Russia, deterrence. Every major news network focused on the summit. Every political analyst debated the same questions. Will NATO spend more? How long can Europe continue supporting Ukraine? Can the alliance remain united? These are important questions, but they are also the questions everyone is already asking. Strategic surprises rarely happen where everyone is looking. They happen somewhere else. And while television cameras remained focused on conference rooms and diplomatic meetings, hundreds of sailors were preparing for something very different. Thousands of kilometers away, Russian warships arrived in Qingdao, one of China's most important naval ports. There was no emergency announcement, no dramatic speech, no public confrontation. Instead, Russian and Chinese naval officers quietly began preparing for Joint Sea 2026. Official statements described the exercise as routine, defensive, designed to strengthen cooperation and improve maritime security. That explanation is not false. Military exercises between friendly countries happen every year. The United States conducts them. NATO conducts them. China conducts them. Russia conducts them. So why should anyone care about this particular exercise? Because experienced military planners almost never focus on official statements. They focus on patterns. Patterns reveal intentions. And the pattern between Russia and China has been changing for years. Every new exercise becomes slightly more advanced. Every year brings greater coordination, more complicated scenarios, more integrated operations, more communication, more trust. Military cooperation does not become stronger overnight. It develops slowly, almost invisibly, until one day it reaches a level where two separate forces can operate together with remarkable efficiency. That is exactly why analysts inside defense ministries pay close attention to exercises like Joint Sea. Not because of what happens during 1 week, but because of what repeated cooperation creates over many years. Think about it for a moment. A speech lasts 20 minutes. A summit lasts 2 days. A political leader may lose an election next year. But military habits, military procedures, shared operational experience, those can last decades. That is why military professionals often say something very simple. Armies do not learn how to fight during wars. They learn before wars. Exercises are where future capabilities are built. And this brings us to the question almost nobody is asking. Why now? Why organize another major joint exercise at exactly the same moment the world's attention is focused somewhere else? Was the timing simply a coincidence? Or was Moscow and Beijing quietly sending a message without saying a single word? Because once you begin looking at the timing, the story becomes much bigger than a naval exercise. It becomes a story about the future balance of power itself. This isn't about ships. It's about strategy. At first, it's easy to dismiss all of this. After all, countries conduct military exercises every year. The United States does. Britain does. Japan does. Even smaller regional powers regularly train with their allies. So why should Joint Sea 2026 be any different? Because this exercise isn't important because of the ships. It's important because of the pattern. Let's step back for a moment. If you look only at this week's exercise, you'll miss the story entirely. Instead, look at the last 10 years. Every year, Russia and China have expanded their military cooperation. First, it was relatively simple naval drills. Then came more complex air operations, joint bomber patrols, missile defense coordination, strategic aviation flights, naval patrols in increasingly sensitive waters, combined command structures, shared communication procedures. Every year, another small step. Nothing dramatic, nothing shocking. But together, those small steps begin to form something much larger. Military organizations don't suddenly become capable of operating together. Interoperability takes years. Different languages, different equipment, different command systems, different military cultures. Every one of those differences creates friction. The only way to remove that friction is repetition. Again, and again, and again. Imagine two professional musicians who have never performed together. Both may be exceptionally talented, but during their first concert, they will still struggle with timing, rhythm, and coordination. Now imagine those same musicians performing together every year for an entire decade. Eventually, they no longer need to think. They simply understand each other. Modern militaries work the same way. Coordination becomes instinct. Procedures become automatic. Communication becomes faster. Trust becomes stronger. And trust is perhaps the most valuable military asset of all. This is exactly what makes Western defense planners pay attention. Not because they believe Russia and China are about to launch a war. There is no evidence of that. The concern is something much more subtle. The more these two militaries train together, the more options they create for the future. Even if those options are never used. Strategy isn't only about fighting wars. Sometimes, the ability to fight together changes the decisions of your rivals before a conflict even begins. That is called deterrence. And deterrence is built long before the first missile is ever launched. Now consider another detail that receives surprisingly little attention. These exercises are taking place in the Pacific. Why there? Because the Pacific has quietly become the center of 21st century geopolitics. Nearly every major power now has strategic interests in these waters, trade routes, energy supplies, semiconductor production, global shipping, military logistics, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, the South China Sea. Everything connects here. Whoever can project power across the Pacific gains influence far beyond Asia. That is one reason why Washington has invested so heavily in strengthening partnerships throughout the region. But while America has been building alliances, Russia and China have been building familiarity. Those are not the same thing. An alliance is written on paper. Familiarity is built through experience. And history has shown many times that military experience can become just as valuable as formal treaties. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Because Russia and China were not always strategic partners. In fact, there was a time when they were preparing to fight each other. To understand why today's cooperation is so remarkable, we have to go back to one of the least remembered confrontations of the Cold War. When Russia and China almost went to war, if someone had predicted this partnership 50 years ago, very few people would have believed it. Because during the Cold War, Russia and China were not close allies. They weren't strategic partners. In fact, for a brief moment, they stood on the edge of war. Most people remember the Cold War as a struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. But there was another conflict quietly unfolding inside the communist world itself. By the late 1960s, Beijing and Moscow had become bitter rivals. Political disagreements turned into ideological competition. Ideological competition slowly became military confrontation. Then, in 1969, everything almost exploded. Along the Ushuri River, Soviet and Chinese troops exchanged live fire during what became known as the Sino-Soviet border conflict. Both sides suffered casualties. Both sides rushed additional troops to the border. For months, military commanders prepared for the possibility of a much larger war. Some historians even argue that both governments seriously considered scenarios involving nuclear weapons. Think about that for a moment. The two countries now conducting joint naval exercises once viewed each other as their greatest military threat. Their borders were heavily militarized. Their armies faced one another across thousands of kilometers. Trust didn't exist. Cooperation was unimaginable. For decades, the relationship remained cold, sometimes hostile, sometimes cautious, but rarely friendly. So, what changed? The answer wasn't a single meeting, or one political leader, or one historic agreement. It happened gradually. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, both countries found themselves facing a completely different international environment. Russia was rebuilding. China was rising. Both governments reached the same conclusion. Fighting each other would benefit neither side. Cooperation, however, could strengthen both. Slowly, border disputes were resolved. Trade expanded. Energy agreements followed. Diplomatic coordination increased. Military dialogue became more frequent. Then came joint exercises. At first, small, limited, mostly symbolic, but every successful exercise built confidence. Every meeting reduced suspicion. Every year made cooperation feel more normal. History was quietly moving in a different direction. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when analyzing geopolitics. They assume today's relationships have always existed. They haven't. International politics changes. Friends become rivals. Rivals become partners. And sometimes, the biggest strategic shifts happen so slowly that almost nobody notices until they are already complete. Today, Russia and China still have different interests, different economies, different long-term priorities. They do not agree on everything, far from it. But modern partnerships are no longer built on perfect agreement. They're built on overlapping interests. As long as both countries believe cooperation serves their national goals, that cooperation is likely to continue. And this brings us to the most important question of all. If Russia and China are not trying to recreate NATO, then what exactly are they building? Because the answer may explain why Western strategists are paying such close attention. The Pacific is becoming the center of global power. For most of the 20th century, the center of global politics was the Atlantic, Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, Moscow. Most of the world's biggest military alliances, economic institutions, and diplomatic crises were concentrated around Europe. That world no longer exists. Today, the economic center of gravity has shifted toward Asia. More than half of the world's population lives across the Indo-Pacific. Some of the world's busiest shipping lanes pass through these waters. Trillions of dollars in global trade move across the Pacific every single year. The world's largest manufacturing hubs are located here. Its fastest growing economies are here. Its most advanced semiconductor production is here. And increasingly, its greatest geopolitical competition is unfolding here as well. This is why American strategy has gradually shifted over the past decade. Washington still considers Europe critically important, but its long-term military planning is increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific, not because Europe no longer matters, but because future competition is expected to be concentrated in Asia. China understands this. Russia understands this too. And that is one reason why military cooperation in the Pacific attracts so much attention inside defense ministries around the world. Notice something interesting. Neither Moscow nor Beijing has announced the creation of a new military bloc. Neither government has declared the beginning of a new Cold War. Instead, they simply continue increasing cooperation. One exercise, one patrol, one summit, one agreement, 1 year after another, small steps, almost invisible, until those small steps begin producing very large consequences. History is full of examples like this. Major geopolitical shifts rarely happen overnight. They happen gradually. Then suddenly everyone notices. Think back to the rise of American naval power during the 20th century. It wasn't created in a single year. It took decades of investment, training, industrial growth, logistics, technology, and strategic planning. The same principle applies today. Military power isn't measured only by the number of ships a country possesses. It is measured by readiness, coordination, experience, industrial capacity, supply chains, technology, and perhaps most importantly, the ability to work with partners during moments of crisis. That is why repeated military cooperation matters. Not because it guarantees future conflict, but because it expands future possibilities. Every successful exercise creates more options. Every new operation increases confidence. Every year of cooperation reduces uncertainty between the two militaries. Meanwhile, the strategic environment continues evolving. Artificial intelligence is transforming military planning. Cyber capabilities are becoming increasingly important. Long-range precision weapons continue changing the balance between offense and defense. Space has become an operational domain. The Arctic is opening new maritime routes. Energy security remains a global concern. None of these challenges can be understood in isolation. Everything is connected. And that may be the biggest lesson of all. The story isn't simply about Russia. It isn't simply about China. It isn't simply about NATO. It's about a global strategic landscape that is becoming more interconnected every year. Which brings us to the final question. If today's changes continue at this pace, what could the world look like 10 years from now? Because the answer may be very different from what most people expect. The real message behind the drills. So, what is the real message behind Joint Sea 2026? Is it a warning to NATO? A signal to Washington? A rehearsal for future conflict? Perhaps. But the answer is probably much more complicated. Military strategy isn't only about preparing for war. Often, it's about preventing one. Throughout history, nations have demonstrated strength not because they wanted to fight, but because they wanted to influence the decisions of others. Power changes behavior, sometimes without a single shot being fired. And that may be exactly what Russia and China are trying to achieve. Not by announcing a new military alliance, not by making dramatic threats, but by quietly showing that their cooperation continues to deepen. For decades, the international system was shaped by a single dominant military power. American naval forces could project influence across nearly every major ocean. Its alliances stretched from Europe to Asia. Its military presence became part of the global balance. That reality hasn't disappeared. The United States still possesses the world's most capable military. Its alliances remain extensive. Its technological advantages remain significant. But today's world is becoming increasingly competitive. Other powers are investing, modernizing, expanding, learning, not necessarily to replace the existing order overnight, but to ensure they have greater influence over tomorrow's order. This is where many observers misunderstand geopolitics. They imagine history moving in dramatic leaps. One crisis, one war, one treaty, one speech. In reality, history usually moves through accumulation, small developments, repeated over many years, until eventually the world looks completely different. Think about the internet, artificial intelligence, global supply chains. None of them transformed the world in a single day. They evolved, quietly, gradually. Then suddenly, everyone realized everything had changed. Military strategy often follows the same pattern. Joint exercises become joint patrols. Joint patrols become routine coordination. Routine coordination creates strategic familiarity. Strategic familiarity creates new options. And new options reshape the calculations of every major power. This is why analysts are paying attention. Not because today's exercise changes the balance of power. It doesn't. One naval drill cannot do that. But repeated cooperation, year after year, can. That is the real story. The exercise itself will end. The ships will return home. The headlines will disappear. Another global crisis will dominate the news cycle. Most people will move on. Military planners won't. Because they aren't measuring 1 week. They're measuring 1 decade. And over the last decade, The direction of travel has been remarkably consistent. More cooperation, more coordination, more strategic dialogue, more military familiarity. Whether that trend continues will depend on decisions made in Moscow, in Beijing, in Washington, and in capitals across Europe and Asia. No one can predict the future with certainty. Geopolitics has always been shaped by unexpected events, unexpected leaders, unexpected crises, unexpected opportunities. But one lesson remains constant. The biggest strategic changes rarely announce themselves. They develop quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, until one day, the rest of the world realizes it has been watching the wrong story all along. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of this week's events. While millions of people were watching speeches, others were watching ships. History has a habit of rewarding those who notice the difference. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the forces shaping the future of our world. Because the next major geopolitical shift may already be happening. We just haven't noticed it yet.